Now, one of the things that I enjoy doing is going on work and witness. I'm scheduled to go next March to my 26th work and witness trip. I just enjoy missions. I enjoy doing things. I like working out and with the work and witness crew. One of the things that they learned very early when I was on work and witness is it's dangerous to put a saw and a hammer in my hands. I am not a builder. I want you to know that. So they stick me out on the cement mixer, and you know I can't do any damage. So I go out there and I load the cement mixer and run that thing and run a wheelbarrow. They feel kind of safe with me doing that. Around our house, when things need to be done, Mary does it. When the local center has various classes, on carpentry and electronics, I'm always wanting to sign her up because she's the worker around the house. I don't know how to build. Somehow there's a disconnect between my head and my hands. But we're all in the building process, whether we're a builder or not. Jesus talks about a builder. He does it in Matthew chapter 7. So let's talk this morning about constructing a house. Matthew chapter 7, if you have a Bible or if it can be thrown up on the screen this morning, Matthew chapter 7, beginning in verse 24, Jesus has some words, not just for the people of his day, but he has some words for us as well. Matthew 7, beginning in verse 24. Would you stand, please, as we look at God's word together? Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rains came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. When Jesus had finally finished these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. Thank you, and please be seated. What I want to do this morning, I just want to start out this morning by testing your knowledge of American literature. Before my wife and I became pastors, we were both school teachers, and I taught in the English department. So let's test your knowledge of American literature, because there's a very famous story in the history of American literature that's similar to the one I just read. In the other story, there are three characters who are builders. Each of them construct a house, and it's a contrast between wise and foolish building. In the other story, each house that was built faces a test, and if the house has been built wisely, it stands, but if it's been foolishly, it falls. Anybody want to guess what that American story in American literature is? We learned it early in childhood. What is it? Three Little Pigs. Mary, we have a very literate congregation here this morning, We must have English people here today. Well, every little pig builds a house, and every house faces the big bad wolf, and one day the wolf comes by and says, little pig, let me in. And the little pig says, not by the... I wanted to see if I could get you to say that this morning. Now, two of those little pigs built their house out of junk. Maybe it was because it was easier, or maybe it was because it was cheaper, but they never stopped to ask questions. Questions like, will this house face the wolf? Will it stand the wolf test? Now, one of those little pigs built his house wisely, and it stands. And there's something about house building, something about the metaphor for our lives that kind of runs deep this morning. Jesus tells us a story about house building. It's really one of those stories that's two stories side by side. Now, when you get a parable like that in one of the teachings of Jesus, the best way to understand that is to see where the two stories are alike and where the two stories are different. Because you see, when you find out whether two stories are different, that's the hinge on which the whole story turns. And then you can really find out what Jesus is really after. So let's walk through this story together this morning. And the very first thing I want you to see is this. Every person builds a house. Every person builds a house. That does not vary, folks. That is not optional. Now, to really understand that, just replace the word house with the word character, or soul, or life. Because Jesus is saying to us, you and I are constructing an eternal soul. And the material out of which you and I construct that are the choices that we make. And what matters in your life and my life is our soul this morning. That's what matters in eternity. And you are constructing every day, good or bad, deliberately or casually, with wise choices or foolish choices. And every time you and I choose, we are building an eternal house that is going to last forever. Now, the problem is, we little piggies, is that we've made some foolish choices. Let me ask you this morning, you see, I don't know you, so let me ask you this morning, anybody here ever made a foolish choice? I'm going to have a mass confession in a moment, but if you ever made a foolish choice, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand a little bit later, but let me run through a few categories first this morning to help jog our memories. Have you ever this morning made a commitment that you wish you hadn't? Have you ever said something that you later wish you had not said and you came to regret? Have you ever dated someone who was not a model of character? If you've ever made that kind of foolish choice, any of those, would you raise your hand? Ooh, all over this place. If you've ever made a foolish choice about time or money or behavior or vocation, if you've ever made a foolish choice about parenting or the stock market or spiritual life, raise your hand, would you? My goodness. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to turn to the person next to you and say, who's closest to you, and say to them, I am one foolish little piggy. Would you do that? Aren't we all? You see, you and I are building a house. And the Bible clearly tells us God is very interested in the house that you and I are building. Now that metaphor is used a number of times. Paul, writing to the church of Corinth, puts it like this. We are various materials that can be used to build on that foundation. Some use gold and silver and jewels. Some build with sticks and hay and even straw. There's going to come a time of testing at Christ's judgment day to see what kind of material each building uses. Everyone's work will be put through the fire so that all can see whether or not it keeps its value and what was really accomplished. Then every workman who is built on the foundation with the right material and whose work still stands will get his pay. Ladies and gentlemen, what a day that's going to be, and that's really going to happen, and the house is going to get burned up, and we're going to suffer great loss if we don't build correctly. You and I are responsible for our house, for our character, for our soul, for our life, whether we like it or not. It's not optional in Jesus' story. It's all of us have to build. Now, sometimes people do some goofy things with their houses. And there's actually a house located out in San Jose, California, that is called the Winchester Mystery House. Anybody ever been there, ever heard about that? Winchester Mystery House. The woman who built that house, Mrs. Winchester, and when you take a tour of that house, the guide will tell you its story. Apparently, her husband was the Winchester rifle guy, and she was the heir to all of his money, and he died, and their child died, and when they did, Mrs. Winchester turned to the occult. And she developed a rather odd belief that as long as she kept building that house, death would be confused. And death would not come for her, and somehow she would be saved. So she built this enormous house. People do that sometimes, you know. People get all wrapped up in their physical house and they build monuments to themselves. Well, 16 carpenters worked every day, and they worked for 38 years in order to build that house. Now, folks, that house contains 2,000 doors. It has 160,000 windows, more windows than the Empire State Building. The front door cost $3,000. Remember, back in those days, a long time ago, $3,000 would build you a grand house. She spent that amount of money on the front door, and then while she was living, that door was only used one time. The workmen who installed that door there walked out of them after installing them, only time the doors were ever used. You can go upstairs, and the stairs lead to a ceiling, and when you get to the top of the ceiling and open the door, it opens to a brick wall. But apparently, part of the deal in building that strange house was she was hoping somehow she could confuse death. Now, she was still building that house, and when death came, death was not confused. They tell us it took 8 trucks working 7 days a week for 6.5 weeks to haul all the junk out of that house that she had compiled. And then the truck made one more trip. And this trip was for her. Because you see, no matter what kind of house you build, and there's some very impressive houses in this part of the country, one day that truck is going to come for me, and it's going to come for you. And folks, that's a constant. We're all building houses, whether we want to or not, whether we build badly or whether we build well, we are all house builders. But you know, there's a second thing I want us to see here, and that is every house faces a storm. Every house faces a storm. The wolf comes to the door of every little pig, and we're all house builders, and we're all storm facers. Now, if you read through the story here of Jesus, when you read the description of the 2 storms, you'll find that the storm that came to the house on the rock and the house on the sand is identical. They are absolutely the same storm. Jesus wants to make it very clear, it's not how we're going to build a house where there will be no storms. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the wind blew and beat against that house. Matthew chapter 7:45 and 7:24. Now, you and I would really prefer a story about 2 climates, about 2 different places with 2 different kinds of weather. Let's say California and North Dakota in the middle of wintertime. Wise man builds his house in California. However, I know a guy whose parents lived in Rockford, Illinois. He had lived there most of his young life, and eventually he moved to Southern California in order to go to college. And he kept telling his parents how great the weather was in Southern California, and that they should move there because the sun is always shining in Southern California. So eventually his parents picked up and they moved there. Anybody remember a few years ago how much rain they got in Southern California? Remember those great mudslides that they had? Anybody remember there was a woman where a whole hill of mud slid down there, and she was trapped inside her condo by the mud, and workers had to break through the wall of the condo in order to rescue her. That rescue effort and that wall was shown around the world on CNN. That wall was the walls of the condo where this guy's parents lived. That condo where his parents lived, the authorities had to red tag because it was too dangerous to be there. And the parents ended up in temporary housing, not sure when they could get back to their house. And the whole thing was a mess because he told them to come to Southern California where the sun always shines. Now, he did tell his parents That there was no guarantee that if they stayed in Rockford, Illinois, a storm would not hit them in Rockford. Because you see, if you live in Rockford, Illinois, there are two problems that you face. One problem, if you're in Rockford, is that a tornado might come through and huff and puff and blow your house down. The second problem, if you live in Rockford, is even if a tornado doesn't come through, you still live in Rockford, Illinois. My apologies to all the Illini who are here. So Jesus doesn't tell us the kind of story we would like for him to tell. This is not a story of how to find some place where storms don't come. Now, I know. There are some people in Delaware, there are some people probably right here in the sanctuary this morning who are thinking to yourself right now, but Pastor Mike, you know, I'm smart enough, I'm rich enough, I have enough resources, I am successful enough, I can engineer a storm-free life, I can take care of myself. But Jesus says, no, you can't. In fact, this is his prediction. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 6, therefore, do not worry about tomorrow. And what is his next line? Do not worry about tomorrow because everything's going to be great. Don't worry about tomorrow because the weather's going to be really good. Don't worry about tomorrow because you can take care of yourself. No, he says, don't worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will bring worries enough of its own. Today's trouble is enough for today. And what is Jesus' prediction? Trouble today, trouble tomorrow. That's the world in which you and I live. I think about the man. The man had great family, great kids, and a wonderful home. And about a couple of years ago now, he walked into his office and on that day found out that his company was downsizing. And he was without a job. Really nice guy, really bright guy. But a vocational storm hit him. I think about that group of guys who had gone to college together. There were about 8 of them, and one time or another they all roomed together in college. And once a year, some of them all got together, sort of a reunion. And one of those guys hadn't been there for a while, and he was asking the others about their family and about their children. And he was the last guy in the group to get married, and so his wife and he never had children. And so one night they asked him, how did that all happen? And he talked about his dream. About his dream of his whole life, that he wanted to be a dad. And then he explained why, for a variety of reasons, that dream had died. And how that sometimes he wakes up in the middle of the night and he thinks to himself at that time, you know, I'm never going to be able to hold my child. I will never be a dad. That was his storm. John Ortberg tells of a time when he lived in Chicago in a cul-de-sac, and there was another family, great family, that lived across the way from him in the cul-de-sac. The husband of that family was named Andy, and Andy was one of those guys, you know, that never met a stranger. I mean, he was like the glue in the neighborhood. Everybody liked Andy. Andy was always working on his house, one of those real house builders, you know, and every time Andy finished a project, he would invite the neighbors over for a look, and so he added a gazebo and invited all the neighbors over, and he finished the basement and retiled the floors, and every time he invited the neighbors over there, Andy was just sort of that kind of a guy. And then one day, an ambulance came into the cul-de-sac. It was Memorial Day, 6 o'clock in the morning, and they hauled Andy away on a stretcher. John went over and took Andy's wife to the hospital. Now, Andy was 43 years old, not in really good shape, and John thought, you know, this might just be a wake-up call to him. And John thought, well, I'll start taking Andy to the gym, and we'll work out together, we'll get him back on the right track. And they were all sitting there when the doctors came out and said, we're sorry. He didn't make it. He died. A heart attack at 43 years of age, with a wife and 2 teenage kids. You see, Father's Day is a real deal for them these days. Folks, that's just the way life is. Storms come into every life. And I say that again this morning because I know we live in a world where people think, I'm able, I'm bright enough, I'm good enough, perhaps not Pastor Mike, I'm religious enough. I tithe and I come to church and I teach a Sunday school class and I do lots of stuff. I can engineer a storm-free life. No, you can't. Neither can I. Everybody builds a house. And you are building an eternal soul, and everybody faces a storm, maybe right now. And when the storm comes, that really reveals what really matters. Because you see, what matters in Jesus' story, the hinge point of the whole deal, really comes down to this. What are you building your life on? What are you constructing your life around? Because you see, life is not about storm avoidance. It is not making sure that circumstances are smooth and pleasant. That's why there's rock, and that's why there's sand, and you can build your life on the rock, or you can build it on the sand. Jesus tells us in verse 24, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house rock. Leads me to this observation. Every person chooses the material for his or her life. Every person does. You have to build your life on something. You have to have someone as your authority. And Jesus says, if you do that with me, if you become my child, if you make me the Lord of your life, if you say, Jesus, whatever you say to me, I'll seek to understand and obey that. And that's what I'm going to do with my time and with my money and with my relationships and my values. Whenever the storm hits you, you're built on rock. You won't be sinking. If you build your life on anything else, and folks, you can build your life on other things, build your life on anything else, and you're building your life on sin. And one day, as sure as I'm standing here this morning, a storm is going to come, and you may have a very impressive looking life, but it's going to blow away. Now, the obvious question that when we hear this story that Jesus tells us, the question that comes to us of a guy who builds his house and he builds it on the sand, the question is, how in the world did he get into that mess? Why would somebody do something like that? Very interesting to me that he did not set out to do something evil. Jesus doesn't say he was a wicked man. Now, what's the adjective Jesus uses about this man? He says he's foolish. He's foolish. That's the human condition. Now, when our kids do something foolish, parents always ask the same question. And we've done it for centuries, and I don't know why that we do that. It's a question that is designed to make sense out of the inexplicable. It's a search for meaning and rationality where it does not exist. It's a question, one word, 3 letters. And what is that question? Why? Why did you do that? Why did you stick that spaghetti noodle up your brother's nose? Why did you leave your bicycle where the car runs over? Why did you do that? And the kids give the same answer. 3 words. What are they? I don't know. Of course they don't know. If they knew what they were doing, they wouldn't have done such a stupid thing in the first place. Why? I don't know. Just there. Now, if we're to ask this foolish man, you foolish man, you have one and only one life. You know you're going to die. You know a storm's going to come along someday. Why in the world would you build your one and only life on the sand? And what do you think he would say? I don't know. Just seemed like a good idea at the time. No architect would say, hey, here's some sand. Storm's going to come along someday if we build on the sand here, and when it comes on the sand, it's going to blow this house away. No architect would say that. It just happens. Nobody plans to live a mediocre life. It just happens. And no human being ever walks into a bar and says, I think I'll become an alcoholic someday. It just happens. No couple getting married sits down one day and looks at each other and says, let's plan on ending up in divorce court someday. It just happens. No man has a child and says, I think I'm going to get so busy and so wrapped up in my career, and I'm going to be gone from home so much that my children won't know me, and they'll carry a hole in their heart as long as they live. It just happens. Nobody harbors a grudge inside them and says to himself or herself, I think I'm going to attempt to become a bitter, angry, resentful old person before I die. It just happens. And nobody sits down and plans on going to hell. It just happens. I don't know. So Jesus sets forth this choice. He sets forth the choice for you and for me today. We're all house builders. And we're all storm facers. And Jesus says to you and me, will you build your life on the rock? Will you say, all right, Jesus? Bob Munger, at the end of one of his books, says, don't you get tired at some point where you're trying to clean up one mess after another? Don't you get to the point where you say, you know what, Jesus? Why don't you take control of the house? I'm going to sign it over to you. I want you to have my house built on the rock. I want it to be your house. I want it to be your life. Have you done that? Have you done that? For you see, Jesus says he'll do it. Those who love me, those who obey my teaching, whoever hears my words and puts them into practice, that's what it means really to love God. It means to do what God says. And then we have this wonderful promise. We will come to them and make our home. You see, it's not your house. It's not mine. It's our house with him. Now maybe there's a storm in your life today. I don't know. I don't know you. Maybe there's a job problem. And maybe this morning you're struggling in your marriage. Maybe today there's a divorce that you've recently been through. Maybe this morning you're wrestling with emotions, or perhaps wrestling with some kind of addiction. Maybe you have a child or a grandchild that you love so very, very much, who's going down the wrong direction, and you wish somehow you could fix it, but you can't. Maybe you've lost someone you love. Maybe you've been rejected and your heart is bleeding. I don't know. This morning, a storm comes into every one of our lives. And then the question comes to us quickly, what did you build your house on? And I want to challenge you this morning. Don't wait for the storm to come to decide what the foundation of your life is really going to be. Challenge you. Build your life on the Lord Jesus Christ. And when the storms come, and they're going to come to Christians and like non-Christians, same storm, both houses. To make sure your life is built on the rock, does not falter in the storm. Would you bow with me for a moment? Are you facing a storm in your life today? You See, I pastored long enough. I've seen enough people along the way who by one action or another, by one attitude or another, basically said to me, "Preacher, don't bother me with that stuff. I can take care of myself. I got it all together. I'm good." And then the storm hits. Life begins to fall apart. They don't have anywhere to turn. There's nothing left to hang on to because they built a life. They built a reputation. They built a company. They built their fortune. They've done whatever. And the storm comes. It's too late. I want to ask you this morning, have you built your life on the storm, on the rock? On the rock that stands the test of the storm. With your heads bowed and eyes closed, I don't know how you do it here at Highpoint, but I see we have altars here. And I'm just wondering this morning, is there anybody here who just says, "Pastor Mike, I need to pray. There's some things in my life that I think I'm building around. Did you know that they're really not going to make it when the storm comes? I put my hope and trust in things that I know, I just know I'm going to make it. And I need, Pastor Mike, to settle some things in my life this morning. I need to pray and get myself set on the rock. Doesn't